Okay. The presentation is by Dr. Sarah Osterhoudt, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Indiana University. Sarah's research examines the relationship between people and the environment, especially during times of change. She has conducted long-term field research with vanilla and clove farmers in Madagascar, and her first book is entitled Vanilla Landscape, Meaning, Memory, and the Cultivation of Place in Madagascar. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Werner Gren Foundation, the Thomas J. Watson Foundation, USAID, and Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, among others. Sarah received a combined PhD from Yale University, from the Anthropology Department and the School of Social Environment. Please take it away. My apologies to you again.
No worries. Thank you for the introduction. And first, thank you so much to the CIBER and to Raj and Teresa for the invitation to join this great event. And thank you all for everyone that is in on Zoom, taking time from your Friday morning. So today I'll talk a bit about vanilla and vanilla beans, which I've been working with for over 20 years now. And specifically about when we think of food as a global commodity, how do we also scale down and see food and commodity as a entity that has a life history, that connects with culture, and that also is connecting individual lives and stories and histories around the world. And as Raj noted, I'm an anthropologist, so also we'll talk a bit about how I see qualitative work, social scientists, and specifically anthropologists have contributions to make about sustainability, about food networks, and about global commodities more generally. And while I talk, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or comments or your own experiences to share on the topic, and I'll make sure to leave a lot of time at the end so we can have more of a discussion. So my plan for today is to do a quick introduction and then start with a big picture. What are the connections between food, commodities, and sustainability? And how do I see this technique that we call looking at the social lives of things or cultural history of things or biographies of commodities? How do we see food systems and food networks as also a collection of stories? In particular about vanilla will be the case study that I'm most familiar with, and I'll talk in more detail about how vanilla brings together these layers of food as commodity, including ecological, botanical, cultural, social, political history, all of it together kind of wrapped up in these vanilla beans. And then how we think, again, more broadly about what social lives of commodities and food, how they can connect to more sustainable livelihoods and more sustainable food choices moving forward. So I already told you I was an anthropologist, but I come via a very interdisciplinary background and was always interested in the relationships between people and plants, and especially in agriculture and agrarian landscapes. So I started out as a biology major in plant science, and then I gradually moved to the social science, but always at an interdisciplinary degree, including even my doctorate research was half in an environment school and half in an anthropology department. I came into vanilla kind of oddly, which was my partner and I, after getting married, we decided to join the Peace Corps. And you don't get much say where they put you, but we were lucky enough to get put in Madagascar. And the host in the community where we were working was a association of vanilla farmers in Madagascar. So we don't, they invited us to kind of help. They were awesome at farming vanilla. They in my very biased opinion, they cultivate some of the best vanilla in the world, but they were pretty isolated from communication. They didn't speak English or other languages to help them market their product and let others know what they were doing and then gain more equitable livelihoods. So we were brought in as Peace Corps to work together with these associations to say, what are some ways we could think about markets, we could think about sustainability, and do some more connection that way. So I went back for my PhD after Peace Corps in environmental anthropology, working in the same community with the same vanilla farmers, and really got into, because I fell in love with these landscapes, about how they were not only cultivating vanilla farmers, which they had been doing for generations in agroforest, but also how vanilla became connected to other types of meanings and histories and stories and social organization. So in addition to my academic work, I really try to do a lot of development work to be hands-on. We started a direct trade organization that I co-founded that's still going now. So really back and forth between academic spaces and applied spaces in food commodities. And that's a little longer introduction, but in the spirit of stories that even people, I think it's important to know where I come from, what I'm likely to see and look at, and what I'm likely to miss and not see, and need to hear from others. So in that this is my own story of how I got here and the kind of questions that I ask when I look at food. So what are some bigger picture questions between food sustainability? So as you know, we are facing some serious environmental, ecological, and social issues, including climate change, global equity, environmental justice, social well-being. And agriculture and trade and commodities are key to these discussions. It's really hard to imagine a more just and sustainable world that doesn't really consider the role of food and diet. And not only that people get enough to eat, but they get nutritious food, meaningful food, and food that enhances community more generally. So as probably all know, agriculture presents challenges for using food and land and water and labor, but it also presents really exciting ways to imagine more equitable and sustainable futures. So how do we think of more agroforestry systems is my particular thing I look at, and more integrated, diversified agriculture. How can we bring more types of food to more types of people that also enhance nutrition and sustainability? But it's sort of a circle. So you try to fix or address one part of the food sustainability question, and then other things pop up, including ideas of water, of climate, of energy, including the use of fossil fuels, habitat. How do we share the land that we use for feeding ourselves with other types of species and beings that depend on the same land, and also pollution. So with this more attention, especially in the last 10 years, of sustainable food, the connection between commodities and agriculture, there has been a lot of movements to take agriculture in a more sustainable and kind of more personal direction. To really, one of this is really trying to connect the lives of growers and how food is produced with consumers. We see this just in our own experiences in the supermarket, see the growth of farmer markets, especially in the United States. They really took off in the last 10, 15 years, and that is kind of going against these large-scale supermarket models that you see up in the corner there, where everything is very homogeneous, impersonal, kind of just this crazy almost place bereft of stories and individuality, where you want everything to be interchangeable, to really now trying to get more personal stories and bring in the idea of where food comes from, how it's grown, what kind of care was taken with the land. And a lot of times these stories, if you go around the supermarket now, they're sort of symbolized by these labels or these markers or these certifications. So you might see an organic certification, fair trade certification, shade grown, bird friendly. These certifications are very proliferated. And sometimes it's overwhelming to shop. It takes so long because you want to figure out what everything that you're buying might do or not do. But it's also a way of a big start, I think, in bringing some sense of that what you're looking at in the supermarket, in these food commodities, really did have a whole history of life, a social history that happened before it got to the supermarket shelf. So this is a really important moment, I think, of changing consciousness of what it means to buy and consume food, to stop and think about it. So you see organic and you're like, oh yeah, there are different ways things are farmed, and these choices matter. They matter environmentally, they matter for my personal health, they matter for the health of people who are farming commodities. You see that with fair trade. So these tell a story, and they make you think. They brought in our own consumer awareness to really think about how what we're doing and the choices we're making can impact people and environments of how food is grown. But that being said, why they tell stories, these are very simple stories, right? They're stories that can go on a small circle. They get stamped on a product. You can't go into a lot of detail. That would take forever. But it's the beginning of a story. It kind of piques curiosity, but there's a lot more detail of what these labels and these certifications tell and what they don't tell. And some of what you don't get is that rich, kind of complicated, and sometimes very fraught or histories, political histories, the dynamics of politics, economics, the complex cultural dynamics that go into producing food as a global commodity. And this is where a lot of work in cultural geography and environmental anthropology, political ecology comes in, saying, okay, how do we really delve into that idea of the stories and lives and connections kind of encapsulated by different commodities? And there's a theory and a method that is kind of the social lives of commodities, or the social lives of things. And this was a real kind of breakthrough in both history and anthropology, where usually anthropologists would go out and try to study a place or a phenomenon and really try to get it almost in isolation. A lot of times it was kind of not actually isolated, but we'd have to describe it as we just look at something very much in context. But then this idea of social lives of commodities, or the social lives of things, was like, well, why don't we can learn a lot by not only studying something in place, but how an object or an idea moves around, because things are always moving. People are always trading. We're always exchanging. As humans, we are fundamentally interested in trading and exchanging ideas and things and materials and commodities with other groups and other people. So by not looking at how things move around, we were missing a really important part of economic experience and just human experience. So one famous work was by Sidney Mintz, who is a historian, anthropologist, kind of political ecologist. He did a lot of things, and he really looked at sugar and how the lives of sugar producers in the Caribbean, how their lives and what they were doing and their labor and their categories of existence were really tied to what was going on industrially in Europe at the time, where there was more factory workers who needed sugar to kind of regulate their labor and give them energy. And there was a rise of a consumer class that wanted to eat more sweets. So he really set the stage of saying, by looking at sugar, not just at one place, but see where it was going all over the globe for different populations and cultures and meanings and identities and systems of labor, more fundamentally, but how these stories could not be seen separately. They really interacted with one another, and people were really had their lives connected through something that was sort of surprising. You wouldn't think how much people were connected through global commodities. And this brought a wave now of scholarship that will look at the social lives, social biographies of specific commodities and the stories they tell throughout time, history, politics, where they connect, where they intersect, and how they bring together or not bring together different parts of the world. And this is really emphasizes that commodity production and commodity trade is not just the exchange of money or the exchange of economies, but it's really an exchange of ideas and human experiences. It's a form of culture exchange. So I take that framework and I apply it to vanilla. So here we are in an agroforest of Madagascar. These were a lot of the farmers I partnered with for Peace Corps and also my work. And in this, I take the method of ethnography or participant observation, which is a method anthropologists use, but a lot of other disciplines use, including business, including sociology, political science. And it's really just getting up close with people, the gathering stories. I like to think that anthropology is just gathering stories, telling stories, making sure that stories that aren't usually told or heard as much as they should, that they get amplified and circulated to get a diversity of perspectives when we think and talk about ideas, including food systems. So I look at, how do I understand trade of commodities, production of commodities, as a collection also of stories, and who gets to tell the story? What are the characters in the story, right? The vanilla orchid is clearly a category, but rice is also a story, or the farmers, the ancestors in Madagascar, and in part of the story of how vanilla is farmed. And what are the stories we're not hearing? How can we get more voices and more perspectives involved? And this is just a lot of hanging out. Sometimes when I'll present and people are like, well, I don't understand your method. It sounded like you kind of just hung out and talked to people. It's like, yeah, that was a lot of it. I mean, that's a lot what you do. It's kind of systematic, right? You want to make sure you have a plan and you have a method. It can be interviews, life history, interviews of farmers. I look a lot at landscape. So trying to get oral histories of people who had been in the area and could describe the land changes over time. It involves archive work. It involves just going out and farming. And that gets a real appreciation of the knowledge involved in vanilla farming and how this brings together other types of identities and stories. So what is some of the stories of the production of vanilla, a life history of vanilla? Well, vanilla is an orchid. It's a vine. It's one of the only, let me see if I get this right. It's one of the only orchids where the fruit is the commodity. So a vanilla bean is actually an orchid fruit. And if you eat ice cream or you get something where you see those black specks, those are the seeds. Those are vanilla seeds. The vanilla pod encapsulates all those tiny seeds. So when you're eating your vanilla ice cream with specks, you're eating orchid seeds with it, which is kind of amazing. And the vanilla orchid is endemic to Mesoamerica, and it was used in Aztec diets and ceremonies, some in Mayan as well. And it was brought to Madagascar during the rush of the age of exploration or expansion. You know, there was the rush between Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, all while they were trying to monopolize spice trades in general. Vanilla was definitely one of the ones they saw as potentially a very high value commodity. So it was brought to various places. The French ended up trying to establish vanilla cultivation centers, especially in the Indian Ocean. And this was really then tied to French projects of colonialism and labor, forced labor, slave labor, exploitation more economically and socially. So a lot of this history is not, you know, there's a lot of violence to the history of vanilla, like there is with many spices, of how it was brought around and who kind of claimed ownership and who claimed control over these production systems. So right now there is still vanilla that is produced in Mexico. It's actually a different subspecies that's developed in Madagascar, but the bulk of vanilla as a global commodity, the vanilla beans you're likely to see in extract, almost all come from Madagascar now, more than 80%. It's a production in the production, it's a leader of the production. And these vanilla beans are sometimes grown in kind of large scale plantations or more monoculture that we would think of. But vanilla being an orchid, it's pretty fussy. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to raise orchids in your house or on your own, but it's, you know, they're particular. They're really amazing plants, but they're a little higher maintenance. It's partly why the price of vanilla is so high, is you really have to cultivate it carefully. It can only grow in very particular climatic conditions, more rainforest conditions, which is another reason why Madagascar ended up being a good home for vanilla. So it defies a lot of these large scale schemes for expansive kind of monolithic environments for global commodities. It does a lot better, kind of scattered around, and people have to pay a lot of individual attention to each vanilla vine and each vanilla flower. I'll get more into that later. So how this looks where I work, this is just a agroforestry field, and it's cultivated as part of these complex agroforestry systems. So these are places where there is food crops, subsistence crops, but also other commodities as well for the global stage. There's native species, medicinal plants, trees used to make boats, to make fishing nets, a lot of medicinal species. And what we're seeing here is we see coconut, right, which is used for diet. There's rice plants in the foreground, which is the main staple crop. You see bananas, you see clove trees, you see along the ridge, kind of more endemic timber species. And as part of my work in collaboration with farmers, we inventory these agricultural fields. These are farmers kind of working for us, and these will have hundreds of species, about 30 to 40% endemic or native to Madagascar as part of these vanilla agroforestry systems. So partly the life story of vanilla is a story that involves a lot of other ecological richness and species and diversity, and not only of plants. There's also a lot of these forests, they're homes to lemurs, they're habitats for birds, they have a lot of rich soil chemistry and diversity. They promote kind of healthy hydrological cycles. There's great teams of researchers working to kind of look at these agroforests as diverse and thriving ecosystems. So also not only vanilla as its own species, which is amazing, but what are the interactions and relationships that kind of cultivate this species richness within agriculture? So in all these ways, the vanilla plant itself is a really important character. Its own materiality, its own botany influences how it's grown, right? It needs a lot of attention. This first slide is Armand. As a vine, vanilla has to be looped around. It has to be really regulated, the shade and the sun throughout the year. And it takes 3 to 4 years after you plant these vines to even produce a flower, to even start being economically productive. So farmers have to put a tremendous amount of upfront labor to know that they'll eventually get these economic return. The other way it's a character in the story is that it's not, endemic. It doesn't come from Madagascar or this region of the world. And they have, while people and the French brought the vines over, they couldn't entice pollinators to come. And there's a lot that isn't even understood about the pollination of vanilla more generally. So because there aren't like natural pollinators in Madagascar, every single vanilla flower has to be hand pollinated in order to produce a bean. You see the beans on the bottom there after they're cured. So not only is there all this work and labor in establishing vines, then each time the flowers will bloom once a year, kind of between November and March, and they bloom at different times, and they're only viable for one day, usually in the morning. So farmers have to look vine by vine through these agroforests and make sure they pollinate each flower, or else they lose that bean. There's Martin up in a tree. This one didn't behave. It didn't go in loops. It kind of just escaped and went up a tree. So you have to follow where the vines go. This is other part of the ecology and biology of the vine. And then once the flowers are hand pollinated, they produce a bean. And these beans are green. I think you saw them in the other slide. They look like fat green beans when they're raw. You have to harvest them at the right time. And then there's a curing process, which is another 6 to 8 months. You have to blanch them in hot water. There's Dela doing that with the basket. Then you have to lie them out. They're sun cured. They have to have a certain amount of sun every day and have to be turned and worked and sorted. There's a group of farmers in the right-hand corner doing this. And this again is daily work, daily care. It's a ton of knowledge. You have to know exactly how hot the water should be, when the flower is ready to pollinate, how ripe the bean is for harvest, how to shape them, how to sort them. And it's only after that, it's almost a full year. Each bean is probably touched hundreds and hundreds of times with this care. And then you get these cured vanilla beans that might be exported and turned into extract, or you might buy them as a bean. They might be used for paste. They might be used for other food products. But there's a lot of labor to make this vanilla plant into a commodity. So there's not only these ecological and botany stories or labor or political stories or history or colonialism. Vanilla becomes a real, what I like to focus on is how this becomes a cultural story, how the social life of vanilla really intersects with the social life of communities. And really being a vanilla farmer is a source of pride and identity for a lot of people I talk to. They know this is hard. They know they're really good at it. They know this is, so many other countries have tried to jump into this vanilla cultivation space, and really know Madagascar remains one of the places that produces really good, consistent vanilla despite all the challenges. So I taught some English classes as a Peace Corps volunteer, and the first thing people wanted to know how to say is, I am a vanilla farmer, right? Well, first, hello, my name is, but the next thing is, I'm a vanilla farmer. This was a really sense of identity and pride. It was a way to bring generations together. It was a way to have a vocation that was a lot of work, but also kind of relatively pleasant work compared to some of the other labor and job options that were available. And it was a source of income. Like, it was a way to really make money compared to many other crops. They have cloves in the area, which is also a good source of income, but nothing really on the scale. And even though vanilla had these big price booms and busts, it would provide a baseline income that was really helpful and appreciated by families. So it was really an economic appreciation as well. Not all households and all farmers benefited equally. So you did get some stratification. So I don't want to overly romanticize how this worked in communities. There are definitely larger scale vanilla farmers that did pretty well, and a lot of especially younger families or families moving into the area, because vanilla takes land, it takes labor, it takes time. It was harder for a lot of families to start getting established. It can be almost a generational process. So those are some of the stories from the production, and there's also a lot of stories in between. So Mince's work was amazing, but it really focused on these two separate spheres. Like, this is how sugar was grown, and this is how it was consumed. And a lot of these sort of follow the commodity or social life of things, really look at those two spheres, which are important and kind of drive the system. But I also really like looking at these in-between spaces of trade, right? How things move. I think there's this myth of globalization that things seem like they just disappear one place and seamlessly appear somewhere else. But there's a lot of work involved, as many of you probably know if you work in agriculture or commodities, and a lot of knowledge and a lot of social skills and connections. And how do you get things from place to place? And what is all that other labor of packaging, of exporting, of transporting, of putting things on the shelf, of working in the supermarkets, in certifying, right? These are all different types of stories that bring different lives and people and connections into making food a global commodity. So what are those spaces of movement, and what keeps things moving, right? It's really hard to keep vanilla moving. This is a forest of vanilla that has to get from these relatively, these places in Madagascar that aren't connected to good roads. This is the national highway. There's spots in this that you just have to forage where the river meets the ocean. And you go by canoe places, you go by pickup, you go by boat, you go by truck. What are all these other stories? And I won't go into all of them now because there's too many, but just to say in general that you can find these social lives in unexpected and pretty interesting places, including certification. So to go back to the beginning, and you see this USDA organic sticker that, and this has so many life stories and people involved. Oh, I'm sorry, her head got cut off here. So this is the actual certification process that we were involved with farmers. And it really also involved like people from outside of Madagascar, from the city of Madagascar, journeying. This is a picture of the Route National 5 and the pickup truck that we were bringing the certifier into to look at these vanilla beans. The pickup truck actually broke in half on one of these rocks. So we had to walk in the last few kilometers. And then the certification process itself was really interesting. It brought these stories of, we need to know vanilla in numbers, we need to codify it, we need to put it in spreadsheets, everyone needs to sign papers and write maps. And this was a very different way of presenting work or thinking about work for vanilla farmers. And what were those translations to make things, to make that story have that label that translated that story to shoppers, in the US or in Indiana, so we could see that label. What are the different forms of representation and what's left out of those stories, and whose story counts, right? So what becomes most important in labeling or commodities certain ways. So finally, now we get to the consumer. After it goes through the movement, it goes through the certification, things get written down and classified. And how does it look? What are the life history of vanilla kind of in this other, nearing the end of its life history as something we eat as an ingredient? Well, it's interesting, in Madagascar, very few people, especially where I work, will eat vanilla. It's not used in the local cuisine. It's not something that people cook with or bake with very often. Sometimes they'll drop some beans in like a sugar canister for coffee. Sometimes they'll do like rum arrangé and kind of steep rum and vanilla beans. But it's not, it's not what they eat, it's what they grow. I remember talking to one of my good friends very beginning on in vanilla, and he's like, you have to understand, in Madagascar, we grow vanilla, and you guys, you eat it, and that's kind of how it goes. But it's a very interesting way of looking at food, what becomes food when, right? And also for food, if we think about sustainability, and we can think, what is the sustainable implications of farmers using land, not for rice, not for crops they eat, but for crops that then get shipped around the globe for other people to use as food. So what's the transport carbon footprint of vanilla? At the same time, vanilla brings in the income that helps food security. So from that sense, farmers will say, this is great because I can grow a little bit of vanilla and I can buy a lot of rice to eat. But again, that rice comes from somewhere. So this is what the beginning of cycles, right? You kind of think you're addressing one problem, but then all these other questions pop up about it. And most of the time, how other people cook or consume with vanilla, if you actually use a vanilla bean, you see the photo at the end, you kind of cut the bean open, you can scrape out called the caviar, all those little orchid seeds, and mix it into what you're baking. You can buy vanilla paste, you can buy ground vanilla powder. But really only 1 or 2% of vanilla, of things that are called vanilla flavor, come from natural beans. So all that work and all that land and effort and labor of vanilla cultivation, that's really only about 1 or 2% of vanilla that becomes what we see in cookies or ice cream. 98, 99% is artificial vanilla that's used for vanillin. And vanillin is one of the compounds of a vanilla bean, and it gives us the smell, it gives some of that taste, it kind of coalesces the vanilla kind of essence of a bean. But vanilla beans are way more complex. They have hundreds of volatile compounds that go into a vanilla aroma and flavor. And you have people that are really, really good and experts at classifying the different notes and textures and aromas of vanilla beans, kind of like wine. It has almost that same distinction that you see with a lot of luxury commodities. So there's that way of consuming and knowing vanilla. But really, for most of us, when we see vanilla, it's going to be artificial vanilla, which is used, it's extracted from a eugenol chemical. And there's questions, should this be bigger or not? Should we try to get more natural vanilla? A lot of companies have pledged that they want to move to 10% natural vanilla in their products, 15%. In a way, that's great because we saw those agricultural systems. But in the other way, you say, okay, where does that land come from? How do we scale up or expand these vanilla production systems if the goal is to have more natural vanilla? And another way of consumers around the world are connected our lives with these lives of vanilla farmers that are out in the forest hand pollinating vanilla comes through the biggest buyer of vanilla, or at least was a couple of years ago, I think still is, if anyone can know what that is. And that's Coca-Cola. So they have secret ingredients, or their secret formula was one of the largest buyers of natural vanilla beans. It is in Coke, which is such a global icon. So when you think of how social stories and cultural stories of a vanilla bean, they really have gone global, right? It really is part of something that is seen as representing the ubiquitous global consumption commodity, can all trace back to this work of hand pollinating of these individual vanilla farmers. So next time, if you drink a soda or you see someone drink it, you can think, I know how that traces all the way back to Madagascar. So in sum, what do we see of social lives as we start to really look at the ways of these plants and these commodities, not just as these intersecting kind of anonymous commodities that get bundled and sold, but as individuals, as vehicles that bring meaning and stories. You see, it's not only that vanilla in your ice cream that you're eating, but it's this rich complexity and kind of complication and of history, of politics, of ecology. What were the other species involved? What species were moved out so these commodities could go? What are the energy, the transport, the labor? What are the stories we hear? What are the stories we don't hear? And how can we understand more stories? And it's interesting then to, just to zoom in on vanilla and say, this is what this one thing, a very popular flavor, everything it brings. But imagine if you're walking through the supermarket and every single thing will have those stories. Like bananas have a rich social history. Nutmeg has a tragic, really. I think there was just a book coming out about nutmeg that's amazing, that really looks at that. And these are stories of hope and hardship. They have a lot of meaning. And because they're so fraught, I think it's a site to really make a difference and make a change. So I know we have a lot of students and educators on the call, and I teach a class on global commodities and anthropology where every student adopts a different commodity. So they just pick one. They might pick bananas, they pick black pepper, maybe they pick salt. They just pick a commodity they like, tomatoes. And that they become the expert on that commodity, and further they write the social history, they write a life history of each commodity, and we share them as we go to try to get that sense of depth to how food commodities are become commodities and how we get to see them. So these are not simple stories. They're not always pleasant. They're often really hard. They make us ask hard questions, but they're also changing. And I think that's helpful because it means we can help change them through consumers, through producing. At each of those levels is a locus for change to make it better, to say, how do we want these to be more sustainable and more just and more positive? So it is a way to empower. And I find them kind of empowering because there's so much in there. That means there's so many ways we can jump in and evolve those in more equitable ways. I think I'm at time, so I will stop there. And thank you for listening. And sorry just to go through and not take questions as I go, because I'm not very good at looking at many screens at once. But thank you for your attention. Please be in touch. Here's my email at Indiana University. I'd be happy to hear from anyone and talk more. And I don't know if there is any comments or questions before we move.